Hello, and welcome to Encircled, the Halbe Pocket podcast. Episode 8, the 26th of April. By the early morning of the 26th of April, the combined battle groups of von Luck and Pipcorn had been fighting throughout the night in and around Beirut, trying to dislodge the Soviet defenders from the town and capture the road leading west. Specialist units had managed to destroy some of the Joseph Stalin heavy tanks defending the entrances into the town, but the battle groups were unable to capitalize on this breakthrough due to the intensity of the returning machine gun and artillery fire. The Soviet gunners had also started aiming their artillery rounds into the treetops under which the German attacks had sought cover. These shell bursts rained splinters down onto the German soldiers and refugees, maiming and killing dozens. Von Luck's attempt to outflank the Soviets in Beirut by sending a group north to Muckendorf had also become bogged down, and by the morning of the 26th, Soviet planes were now strafing and bombing the German battle groups at will. To avoid these air attacks, the battle group tanks attempted to also use the cover of the trees when advancing, but the tanks quickly became bogged down by the sandy soil of the forests. Von Luck contacted Busse to give him an update, informing him that his forces had become pinned down on the outskirts of Beirut. The blunt truth was that unless the rest of the Ninth Army were to immediately follow up behind the battle groups and help overwhelm the Soviet forces, the breakout attempt would fail. Busse simply ordered von Luck to remain in position until the rest of the Ninth Army could follow, but he gave no indication as to when that would happen. This was simply no good. The position of von Luck's battle groups was quickly becoming untenable, as their ammunition and fuel were rapidly running out, threatening to eliminate any chance for a successful breakout of his forces. Von Luck therefore gathered his senior commanders and informed them that they were going to disregard Busse's orders to stay put and wait for the rest of the Ninth Army. He told them he would instead disband his forces, and he gave permission to any men who wished to try and break out to the west. And with this, the first breakout attempt had failed. Some of von Luck's men were able to slip through the Soviet lines, and some were even able to reach American lines in the west, but most who tried to escape were either killed or captured. Von Luck decided to return to the Halbe Pocket in order to personally explain to Busse his decision to abandon the breakout attempt, but he was captured by the Soviets on the 27th whilst attempting to reach the Ninth Army lines. Colonel Pipcorn was killed in action. Soviet sources state that this first breakout led to the capture of 5,000 German prisoners, the destruction of 40 tanks and self-propelled guns, and the capture of a further 200 guns and mortars, equipment and men that the Ninth Army could not afford to lose. In the Ninth Army situation report for the 26th of April, Busse tried to put a bombastic gloss on the failure of this first breakout attempt, and he reminded his men that holding on and fighting to the last goes without saying for the Ninth Army. But the truth was, no amount of cheerleading could improve the morale amongst his men. The Halbe Pocket was shrinking at an alarming rate due to the constant Soviet attacks in the north and east, and the pocket was now down to only 900 square kilometers, 25% smaller than just one day prior. Worse still, the pocket was no longer being supplied by air, meaning fuel and ammunition were quickly running out. But the biggest blow on the 26th had, by far, been the failure of the first breakout attempt. So why did the breakout attempt fail? Well, firstly, as mentioned before, the Soviets enjoyed total domination of the skies, thus they were able to spot the columns of troops moving from east to west within the pocket on the 25th. And the Soviets made sure to bomb each and every road or bridge within the pocket to slow down the progress of those troops. This delayed the arrival of the battle group troops, with units arriving in dribs and drabs at the Halbe front line throughout the 25th. But it wasn't just the battle groups who were impeded, as the rest of the Ninth Army troops who were supposed to pour through any opening in the Soviet lines caused by the breakout of the battle groups were also prevented from reaching the assembly areas in time. Busse's forces were still far too spread out within the pocket, and thus he lacked the numbers of troops necessary to capitalize on the moment when the battle groups punched through the Soviet defenses. Simply put, a breakout would only succeed if the Ninth Army could overwhelm the Soviet defenders in a concentrated area and pass through its lines quickly before the gap was closed again. And this coordination of force was simply not possible for Busse to achieve on the 25th and 26th. In addition, the timeline of orders and the ordered go hour for the breakout were also difficult to communicate given the absolute breakdown in the state of communications within the pocket. This is the main reason why there isn't even a clean overview of exactly when the breakout attempt took place. Some units invariably moved early on their own initiative, whilst others waited and set off later. And lastly, the lack of reconnaissance available to Busse meant he had no idea of the array of Soviet forces facing him to the west. He didn't know where the choke points were located, he knew nothing of the anti-tank traps and defensive lines waiting for his forces, and he had no idea of how many Soviet tanks, infantry and guns were waiting to fire at the battle groups. The surprise factor was lost, intelligence on the enemy was non-existent, and there weren't even enough German troops on hand to overwhelm the Soviet defences. The first breakout attempt was thus doomed from the start. And to be fair, a lot of the reasons behind this failure can be laid at Busse's door. After all, it was Busse who was responsible for organising and sanctioning the attempt. He failed to ensure that the armoured spearhead was supported by enough infantry. He failed to mobilise the rest of the Ninth Army quickly enough to exploit the break in the lines which the battle groups had created. And ultimately, he failed to ensure that the battle groups embarked on their breakout attempt with the ammunition and fuel necessary to sustain an armoured breakout. In Busse's defence, however, his lack of oversight and leadership during this first breakout could be partially explained by the fact that his headquarters had been forced to move in the night from their original position at the Scharmützelsee train station to their new location at the Forsthaus in Hammer, just outside of Halbe. This put him out of contact during much of the night. Regardless of who's to blame for the failure of the first breakout attempt, what is certain is that the Soviets were surprised by the strength and determination shown by the two battle groups. And they obviously understood that the German Ninth Army, whilst a wounded animal for sure, could still inflict lethal damage onto the Soviets. Konev therefore strengthened the defensive positions west of Halbe, and he fed more reserve troops into the areas surrounding Beirut, particularly along the major road between Beirut and Zossen. The 149th and 253rd Rifle Divisions were ordered to new positions along the Autobahn from Teupitz to Terpt. This enabled them to cover the road west to Luckau. The three divisions of the 28th Army's 3rd Guards Rifle Corps were moved to occupy the Lindenburg, Beirut and Dornswalder stretch of woods immediately west of the Autobahn. Plus, elements of 3rd and 4th Guards tank armies were also deployed to strengthen the line. The result of these new deployments was that 3 entrenched defensive cordons with a depth of between 15 to 20 kilometres had now been established, and this strengthening of the defences meant that any future breakout attempt would now face an increased amount of Soviet infantry, tanks and firepower, and even more anti-tank defensive obstacles than before. Konev also took a leaf out of Zhukov's book, and he ordered more frontal assaults onto the Halbe Pocket as well today in order to put more pressure on the Ninth Army. For instance, he ordered his forces to penetrate the southern edge of the Halbe Pocket towards the town of Münchenhof. Whilst the main focus of the day was undoubtedly on the breakout attempt, there was still severe fighting, of course, throughout the rest of the pocket. To give you a flavour of the fighting and of the overall conditions within the pocket on the 26th, here is a quote from SS 2nd Lieutenant Porsche of Tank Hunting Company Dora 2. I knocked out 2 anti-tank guns near Märkisch Buchholz that stood in our way. A few hours previously, I had been awarded the Knight's Cross. A staff officer brought it to me as I could not leave my men. Things were happening as never before in this war. We sat in a pocket and the Ivans hammered us with weapons of all calibers and massive air attacks. Soldiers of all branches of the service and ranks up to general were fighting with rifles or machine pistols in their hands. Men, women and children swarming around us, afraid that we would break out of the pocket and leave them behind. They clustered around us and fell in heaps from Ivan's explosive shells. As often as we tried, as often as we attacked, we still came up against a fresh barrier that cost death and suffering. Whilst the 26th of April represented a painful day of failure for the Ninth Army, its sister army, the 12th, was enjoying more success to the west. General Wenck launched the 12th Army's attack from the line Brandenburg-Belzig, heading towards Potsdam, instead of the German High Command's expected targets of Jüterbog. Wenck had chosen to attack towards Potsdam partially because of the weakness of the Soviet lines there, but also because it would enable him to rescue the 20,000 men of the Potsdam garrison. Plus, Göteborg had been strongly fortified by the Soviets, so it made sense for Wenck to explore alternative routes. The 12th Army attack, led by 20 Corps, enjoyed some initial success, as it had deftly avoided attacking the prepared lines of Soviet defences manned by the 5th Guards Mechanized Corps and 13th Army along the main road between Wittenberg and Potsdam. 20 Corps also managed to catch the 6th Guard Mechanized Corps on an exposed flank, and a number of Soviet units were captured, including a tank workshop and supply columns. And during the night, the Ferdinand Schill Division also arrived on the left flank of 20 Corps, and it was given orders to head for Potsdam. These successes can be attributed to the element of surprise, combined with the 12th Army's aggressive tactics. And once again, the vigour and spirit shown by Wenck's young troops proved to be a decisive factor in the fighting. But whilst his attack had been a success so far, Wenck did not get ahead of himself. His plan still focused on surrendering to the Americans, so he ordered his 20 Corps to secure their left flank along the Elbe in order to keep the 12th Army's passage to the west open. In any case, the 12th Army was also facing some of the same difficulties the 9th Army was facing further east, namely the huge influx of refugees fleeing the fighting in Berlin. These refugees were clogging up the main roads, which were vital for Wenck's forces to move quickly, and due to the constant traffic jams on the roads, his army was forced to move across country, therefore slowing down their progress. After liberating the hospital complex outside of Beelitz the previous day, his forces had continued further into the town itself, and thus they were only 24 kilometers south of Berlin. However, as per Wenck's plan, rather than marching into Berlin, they were going to hold the Beelitz area and transform it into a reception area for Buss's 9th Army, which it was hoped would arrive shortly. In response to the 12th Army's progress on the 26th, Konev had to juggle his forces around to counter both this new threat from the west, whilst also containing the 9th Army to the east. Konev ordered the 117th Rifle Division from the 13th Army to oversee the crucial defence of Luckenwalde, whilst the 280th Rifle Division was stationed as a further backup reserve corps in the Göteborg area. This injection of forces would, it was hoped, enable Konev to engage both the German 12th and 9th Armies successfully. To finish our episode today, we'll check in with the people of Halbe. So whilst the Soviet and German forces shook themselves off after the first breakout attempt of the 9th Army, the people of Halbe were simply stuck in the middle, experiencing hell. The town's inhabitants had by now barricaded themselves into their cellars, but they were finding that no amount of hiding could protect themselves from the fighting. As Ingrid Feusch, a 15-year-old girl from Halbe, recalled, Hans, my eldest brother, was watching a wounded man being bandaged in the yard when the first shell hit the house. He was killed instantly. A French prisoner of war who was living with us brought him down into the cellar. Next day, another shell struck, killing my youngest brother, the 3-year-old, in his cot, as well as a playmate and his grandmother. My mother lost both her feet. That was the most terrible thing. We looked for a medical orderly for hours, but where was the help? Mother cried until the next day. Then she was dead. My 5-year-old brother Ernst and myself were now alone.